Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at R.F. Kuang's Yellowface. Have you heard of this one?
Oh, yeah, it's been making quite a splash. It's definitely got people talking.
It's about June Hayward, a white author who steals a manuscript from her deceased Asian American friend, Athena Liu.
And then she tries to rewrite it to be more authentically Chinese.
And then she publishes it under her own name.
It's wild.
Where do we even begin with something like that? I mean, it's a crazy premise.
I think what's so fascinating is how Kuang uses this kind of outlandish scenario to explore some really uncomfortable truths.
Like what?
Like about the publishing world, cultural appropriation, the whole question of who gets to tell whose stories.
Yeah, so let's start with June. I mean, what kind of person steals a manuscript from a friend, let alone tries to rewrite it to be more authentic?
Right. Well, the book really delves into June's psychology, and you start to see this deep-seated jealousy and insecurity that she has.
Towards Athena?
Yes, towards Athena. And it goes way back to their college days. They were both aspiring writers, and June always felt like she was in Athena's shadow.
So it's like professional envy.
Yeah, there's definitely that. But it goes deeper than that. June feels like Athena took things from her, not just success, but like a personal experience that Athena later used in her writing.
So June feels like she's owed something.
Exactly. It's like she feels entitled to Athena's life and work in some way, and that's what's so disturbing about it. She tries to justify her actions as some kind of reparations.
Reparations? How does that even work?
It's this twisted logic that Kuang is so brilliant at satirizing. June takes this concept of reparations, which is usually associated with addressing historical injustices, and she flips it to center herself as the victim.
Okay, so we've got June stealing this manuscript, and then she decides to make it more authentically Chinese. I mean, how does that even make sense?
Right, it's so problematic. And that's exactly the point. Kuang exposes the inherent racism in June's assumptions about what constitutes Chinese writing.
Give me an example.
Well, for one, she renames the characters. She thinks Chinese names are too hard for Western readers to pronounce or remember.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and she cuts out what she calls unnecessary backstory, as if Chinese characters aren't allowed to have rich and complex histories.
It's like she's creating a caricature of Chinese culture.
Exactly, and she simplifies the narrative. She thinks Western audiences can't handle nuance or ambiguity.
It's all about fitting into this preconceived box labeled exotic Asian literature.
Right, without any regard for the actual diversity and complexity of those cultures. And then, of course, the whole thing blows up online.
Social media goes crazy.
Oh, yeah, it's a complete wildfire. This anonymous Twitter account pops up called @AtheneliusGhost and starts accusing June of stealing the manuscript.
And I bet things spiral out of control from there.
Totally. The online hate campaign against June is vicious.
Yeah.
It's fueled by speculation and half-truths, and it just keeps escalating.
June becomes this symbol of everything that's wrong with the publishing industry.
Right. But it's important to remember that Kuang is playing with layers here. June's downfall isn't just about individual wrongdoing. It's a critique of the industry's performative allyship.
What do you mean by that?
There's a lot of talk about diversity and inclusion, but when it comes down to it, there's not a lot of action.
They're not really changing the system.
Exactly. They pat themselves on the back for publishing a few books by minority authors, but they're not addressing the systemic issues that keep those authors marginalized.
So it's not just about one bad apple. It's about the whole orchard.
Exactly. And just when you think you've got it all figured out, Kuang throws in this crazy twist. The person behind @AtheneliusGhost is Candace Lee.
Candace Lee, the editorial assistant.
Yeah, the quiet one in the corner. No one suspects her.
Hold on. Why would you do that? What's her motivation?
Well, that's where things start to get really interesting. And that's a story for part 2 of our deep dive. So we left off with that bombshell. The quiet Candace, the editorial assistant, is the one behind @AtheneliusGhost.
Yeah, it's a real twist.
It makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about the story.
Totally. So what's her game? Is she just out for revenge?
It's more than that. I mean, she's definitely angry, but her anger is directed at the whole system.
The publishing industry.
Exactly. She sees what happened to June as a symptom of this much larger problem, the way the industry tokenizes and exploits Asian American authors.
Gives them a seat at the table, but only on their terms.
Right. Candace has seen this firsthand. She knows how the game is played.
So she's using June to expose the hypocrisy.
Exactly. She's making an example of June to show the world how the publishing industry really works.
And it's working. I mean, June's career is basically over.
Oh, yeah. Candace knows how to use social media to her advantage. She understands the power of the internet.
It's like a form of guerrilla warfare.
Right. She's using the tools that are often used to silence marginalized voices to amplify her own message.
Let's go back to June's changes to the manuscript for a second. What were some of the specific things she did that were so problematic?
Well, she really tried to sanitize the story. Strip away anything that she thought would be too challenging or too foreign for a Western audience.
Like what?
She renamed characters. One of the main characters in Athena's original manuscript was named Zhang Wei. June changed it to Alex.
Seriously?
Yeah, she thought it would be easier for Western readers to pronounce.
That's like she's erasing their cultural identity.
Right. And she cut out huge chunks of backstory and cultural context.
So the characters become these flat stereotypes.
Exactly. They lose their depth and complexity. It's like she's creating this Chinese story based on a bunch of cliches and assumptions.
And all the while she's claiming to honor her friend.
It's so manipulative. She knows that her supposed friendship with Athena will shield her from criticism.
And it works for a while. I mean, people believe her.
Because they want to believe her. They want to believe that this white woman is capable of understanding and representing a culture that's not her own.
And that's where the whole issue of appropriation comes in.
Right. It's not just about borrowing elements from another culture. It's about taking those elements out of context and using them in a way that benefits the appropriator.
And often harms the culture being appropriated.
Exactly.
So June is profiting from Athena's story, but she's also distorting it. She's telling a version of the story that serves her own interests.
And that's what's so insidious about it. She's not just stealing a story, she's stealing a voice.
And we never really find out what happened to Athena, do we?
That's one of the brilliant things about this book. Kuang leaves it deliberately ambiguous.
So we're left wondering, was it an accident? Or was there something more sinister going on?
And that uncertainty forces us to confront our own assumptions about what happened and who to believe.
It makes you question the whole idea of truth.
Especially in the age of social media where information can be so easily manipulated.
It's like we're all living in this hall of mirrors.
Right. We can't always tell what's real and what's not. And that's a really unsettling thought.
And then there's the fact that Athena's Instagram account remains active even after her supposed death.
Right. It's like even in death, she's still being commodified.
Her story is still being told, but not by her.
Exactly. And that raises all sorts of questions about who has the right to tell certain stories and how those stories are shaped by power dynamics.
This is getting really deep.
That's what I love about this book. It forces you to think about things in a whole new way. We've talked a lot about how Yellowface takes on this whole issue of cultural appropriation, especially in the publishing world. But here's a thought. Does the novel itself end up doing the very thing it's criticizing?
Well, that's a good question. Is it possible for a book about appropriation to not be appropriative?
Right. It's kind of a paradox. I mean,
Yeah.
June steals a story, changes it to fit her idea of what it should be, and then profits from it.
Is Kuang doing something similar by writing Yellowface?
It makes you think about the author's responsibility.
Definitely. I mean, Kuang is clearly aware of this tension. She even blurs the lines between fiction and reality, like making June a writer who went to Yale, just like Kuang herself.
So she's acknowledging that she's part of the system, too. Exactly. No one is above critique, even those who are trying to expose the problems.
It all comes back to that question of who has the right to tell certain stories.
And who benefits from those stories being told.
We've talked a lot about June and Candace, but what about Athena? We never really get a clear answer about what happened to her.
Right. And her Instagram account stays active even after she supposedly dies. It's like she's still present, even in her absence.
It's almost like she's become this symbol, this idea that people are fighting over.
Exactly. June wants to control the narrative around Athena's life and work. Candace wants to use Athena's story to expose the hypocrisy of the publishing industry, but no one seems to be asking what Athena would have wanted.
It's like her own voice has been completely silenced.
And that's the tragedy of it all. This woman's life and work are being exploited even after her death, and she has no say in the matter.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We've covered so much ground. June's twisted motivations, the dark side of social media, the moral compromises people make for ambition, the complexities of representation.
It's a lot to unpack.
If we had to sum it all up, what are the key takeaways from Yellowface? What do we want our listeners to remember?
For me, it's the blurring of truth and fiction in the digital age. We're constantly bombarded with information, and it's hard to know what to believe. Yellowface really highlights how easily narratives can be manipulated and how quickly misinformation can spread.
It's a cautionary tale.
Definitely. And it's a reminder that we need to be critical thinkers. We can't just accept everything we read or see online at face value.
We also have to remember that diversity and inclusion aren't just buzzwords. They're about real change. And that change requires more than just good intentions. It requires a willingness to challenge the status quo and to confront uncomfortable truths.
And it requires us to listen to marginalized voices, to amplify those voices, instead of speaking for them.
Well said. This has been an incredible conversation. Yellowface is a book that will stay with you. It's thought-provoking, challenging, and ultimately hopeful.
It's a book that asks us to confront some hard questions about ourselves and the world we live in, and that's what makes it so powerful.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Yellowface. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. And if you have, I hope this conversation has given you some new insights. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.